From KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. On air and online, this is Intersection.
Hello and welcome to Intersection, where people and ideas meet online and on KBIA. I'm Ryan Famuliner. Last week, Missouri lawmakers approved a package of tax credits aimed at attracting a new Boeing facility to the state. Missouri is just one of a little over a dozen states competing to house the new production site of Boeing's 777X airliner. The company is considering its options following a labor dispute with a machinists union in Washington state. Missouri's bid offers the company up to $1.7 billion over 23 years, the exact amount depending on the number of jobs created. The state is also offering assistance with job training and a pledge from union groups to work around the clock without overtime to build the facility as quickly as possible. Governor Nixon is widely expected to sign the bill before Boeing's deadline tomorrow. The company is expected to announce a decision early next year. And today on Intersection, we'll take a closer look at Missouri's offer and talk about ways the state could best attract businesses in the future. Joining me in studio today, Chris Kelly is the Democratic State Representative for a part of northeastern Boone County. Representative Kelly, thanks for joining the show.
Happy to be here.
Dan Meehan is the President and CEO of the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the state's largest business association. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And Brian Dobson is the Associate Dean of MU's Truman School of Public Affairs. Brian, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And for you and our audience, what do you think of Missouri's offer to Boeing? Is it too generous or not generous enough? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet at intersectkbia. So to get us started, and we'll dive into this further as the show goes on, but part of this whole story here with Boeing is that these corporations are able to make requests of states to bring all these different incentive packages. What kind of leveraging power do these corporations now have compared to the states? I don't know, Representative Kelly, in your experience, especially in recent years.
It's big, and it especially for something like this Boeing deal or the Ford deal that Governor Nixon put together before, because so many jobs come. It generates a lot of wealth in the society, in the state. There's a lot of ancillary supply line businesses in little communities around the state. And so there's a lot of economic and political interest in it.
Right. And so when it comes down to it, though, I mean, are corporations just more powerful than states right now? Yeah, Brian?
Well, Boeing is a very interesting case because it has become very experienced in extracting large amounts of money from state governments and elsewhere. If you just go back 10 years to 2001, when they wanted to relocate their headquarters from Seattle, they invited bids from Chicago and Dallas and Denver. And in the end, Chicago ended up paying $55 million to attract 500 jobs. Mm-hmm. They did it again with the Dreamliner. In I think it was 2003, they got $3.2 billion out of the state of Washington to build the Dreamliner. And then in 2009, they pushed out some of the production to South Carolina. And South Carolina gave them $900 million. So we're now in a pattern that every time they have a new plane, a new piece of development, they put it out to bid, and this time it's 12 to 15 states. But the real act to beat, as far as Missouri is concerned, is Washington's own bid, and they've put in. I think I'm trying to remember the amount that they've put in. It's about $3.4 billion that they're now offering to keep them in Washington. Mm-hmm. So no corporation worth its salt is going to go about a development project without first seeing what it can get from the state that it wishes to locate in.
I was going to ask, is Boeing just more adept at this than other companies, or other companies use the same moves?
Other companies do it all the time, but Boeing is one of the stars in this in terms of the sheer scale of money they've managed to pull from different states. Mm-hmm. And the CEO argues that basically this is a way of reducing the costs of business.
It's pretty much supply and demand. If you look at the demand for the state is getting those high-quality jobs, 2,000 to 8,000, depending on how this project is scaled. And if you look at the competition out there, Boeing's a unique case, not necessarily for the commercial side, but for the military aircraft side. But we're competing with other states, other countries. We're competing with Singapore, Ireland, Germany, you name it, for these opportunities. And like Brian said, there's the states aren't just, or companies are getting fairly good at this. They know what's at stake, and they know they can leverage a deal to make it as competitive as possible to locate in a state or a country wherever they can go. Mm-hmm. The states that will do this will win. We're one of 12 to 15 states, and Chris, I don't know, I've rarely do you see a company come to the legislature and ask for an incentive like the Ford bill or like others that we've seen, Wholesome Cement, for example. Boeing didn't show up. They simply put the RFP out. Their lobbyists weren't even in the hearing rooms, but it's that valuable that it coalesced St. Louis City, St. Louis County, the state of Missouri, business, labor, you name it, all together. And the magnitude and scale of that was something that needs to be reckoned with.
Sure. And just for our audience, we're going to mention RFP a lot throughout the day. It's a request for proposals that Boeing put out. But I guess, Dan, maybe get your thoughts on the plan that did pass. Again, the governor hasn't quite signed it yet, but Missouri's incentive plan. What are your thoughts on that and its chances, I guess?
I think its chances in attracting Boeing.
Yeah.
I think we'll get a piece of the pie. I'm not sure how big it will be or small it will be compared to the pie. But if you look at what Boeing likes to do, they like to spread their facilities out into as many congressional districts that they can get in, because their main customer is the Department of Defense, and they need to have a big footprint to make sure they have sway to compete with other aerospace giants and military competition. So I think we get something out of this. St. Louis has a very skilled workforce with the legacy from McDonnell Douglas, then Boeing, with the fighter aircraft and the other aerospace industries that Boeing has there on the facility. And if you look at what's happening on the military side, which is what St. Louis is, the production of the F-18 is going to slow down, and someday it's going to end. And they've got that facility. More importantly, they got the talent there. And so I think St. Louis is in a very competitive position.
So, again, not necessarily saying we feel really confident about this particular big project, but also isn't there a chance to get this project could be sliced into pieces as well?
That's
right?
exactly right.
Yeah.
It could be the IT and the design. It could be, we've heard a lot in the last couple of weeks about building the wing. The wing on these new aircraft are really where the new technology is, with the composite design and what have you. And a lot of that happens at a company called GKN right next door to Boeing on the north side of the runway. So we could get a component of it, or maybe we get the whole thing if we were lucky and good. But what we did last week, what the House and Senate did with the governor calling them into special session, was simply put us in the game. Now it's up to Boeing and the negotiations that go on right now. I will say that St. Louis City and St. Louis County are also putting together their own packages, and from what I heard, the county is going to be a big one.
It's important to recognize that one of the things in the governor's proposal is that Boeing will only get subsidies tied to the people that actually go to work. So they don't get, if they bring a piece of the action, they get only the amount of money that is attachable to those employees who actually are on the payroll in Missouri. So it's tailored very specifically to how many people go to work.
Yeah, that 1.7 billion number is tied to what 8,000 something jobs, I think, right?
That's the full deal. It's $150 million a year, and that's at full scale. But like Chris is saying, it's a scalable project. So if we get 2,000, it's based on that number, but it's all performance based. They have got to put up the capital investment and the investment in jobs and create the jobs before they get an incentive. Another thing that's important is these aren't new programs. These are existing programs at the Department of Economic Development that we're simply saying raise the cap to a level to accommodate what could be 8,000 new jobs in the whole project. But it's pegged at however many jobs we get.
Is Brian?
I was just going to say, I misspoke earlier. The offer that Washington has put together is $8.7 billion. They are determined to keep that plant in if they possibly can.
And there's a reason it's that big. What they have to offset is their gross receipts tax, which we don't have. So they pay a huge amount of tax on whatever's moved off the line, and that's Washington put themselves in that position, and that's why like Brian's saying, that offer from Washington has to compete against their own tax structure.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's
Representative
two
Kelly.
interesting aspects to that. One is, did the governor and the legislature and the chamber and all the partners do a good job responding to this particular request for proposal? And the other track is, what about all this business in total philosophically? Is it a good idea or a bad idea or what? And those are, I think, very different conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we'll go there later, I think, too. Before we get there, why don't we talk a little bit more about this specific plan
Yes.
and maybe the Washington State plan? I mean, there's been a lot of talk. One thing that Boeing did put out in its RFP that it asked for was, or it would like to have a seaport, and obviously that's tough for Missouri to offer. What's the chance, I guess, of getting over that hump and that problem with our plan, if you will? And also, I guess, there's been some, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, basically a subhead of one of their stories recently said, is Missouri getting played in this, basically just helping Boeing in their bargaining power with Washington State. I guess, what are your thoughts on how this might actually play out?
We don't get hurt.
Yeah.
If we compete and don't win, the cost of doing that, the ante, if you will, is pretty small compared to the possibility of the pot.
Okay.
And we tried to put the seaport in as an amendment, but it was ruled out of order.
No tide. However, we do have a pretty good river port, and a lot of us have been trying to expand the river port for a while. You can ship almost anything that they want down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and there's people have been doing that since there's been a St. Louis.
Sure.
And we're lucky in Missouri. We're the cross section of the entire nation, of the continent, really. So we've got the third largest rail terminals. We've got the sixth most traveled interstates in the country. So it's a great place to be able to serve as a logistics hub, and Boeing can profit by that. Like Chris says, we have access to New Orleans via the river, and people are transporting commodities and heavy goods every day on it.
Right. What are some of the other requests, too, I guess, things that Boeing is going to be looking at here as they make this decision again, probably next year?
Well, early next year. We expect it before mid-February. Workforce, assets on the ground, the tax policy, all the macro factors that companies use to make the decision.
Technical training at the community colleges.
The community college got together, and they were a great partner in putting together a united front with this. We build the best fighter aircraft in the world in St. Louis. There's a lot of expertise there that could move over and translate into the commercial side. So they look at the whole equation called economic development, and the job training, the economic development incentives, the tax increment financing proposal that they're looking at. All that comes into play.
Right. I guess one other quick thing. This is good for you, Chris, even though you weren't actually there last week because you were on pre-planned vacation, if that's correct.
But I was cyberly there. I was with my grandchildren in Disney World.
Right. That's a pretty good excuse. So were you surprised, though, to see how quickly this sailed through the legislature and see how things played out?
No, I wasn't. The great practical middle of the legislature followed the governor's excellent lead on this. The private sector was very engaged. The chamber, as Dan said, the labor unions, the business communities in St. Louis and Kansas City, and really around the state were very engaged in this and engaged right away. And one of the things that we found in Columbia that's important with economic development is, do you have a seamless team? And we had very, very little dissension on this. It's interesting that all the dissension came from the far left or the far right, and there was not much of that.
I want to take one moment to remind our listeners that this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Ryan Famuliner, and today we're talking about Missouri's efforts to attract a new Boeing production facility to the state. On Friday, lawmakers approved a measure providing the company up to $1.7 billion over 23 years. Today on Intersection, we're talking about the incentive package and also discussing ways the state could attract businesses in the future. Joining me in studio for the conversation today, Chris Kelly is a Democratic state representative for part of northeastern Boone County. Dan Meehan is the president and CEO of the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Brian Dobson is the associate dean of MU's Truman School of Public Affairs. We'd also love to hear from you in our audience. Why do you think Boeing should come to Missouri? What can we offer that other states can't? Share your thoughts. Give us a call at 573-882-8925 or email intersection@kbia.org. You could also tweet at IntersectKBIA. We'd like to remind you that you can watch Intersection as streaming video online during our live conversations every Monday afternoon at 2 at kbia.org. You can watch that video and join our online chat by going to kbia.org and scrolling down to the link for Intersection. Again, that's Mondays at 2 online at kbia.org. Okay, now to get in closer to that territory you were taking us to earlier, Representative Kelly, Governor Nixon did take some criticism last week, pushing very hard for this Boeing proposal, but also he had vetoed House Bill 253 this year, which was broader tax cuts that many Republicans, especially that pushed it in the legislature, were saying was going to help attract businesses to the state. So what do you think of, I guess, the governor's actions in this whole
Governor's
scenario?
leadership on this was widely praised. He involved people. He responded quickly and efficiently. This is the kind of thing that Jay Nixon does very, very well, and he did very well on this particular occasion, as he has on others. And nobody would accuse me of being a cheerleader for Nixon. But the fact of the matter is, his leadership on this was exemplary.
Dan, I wonder your thoughts on that too, and specifically about that tax cut bill as well that was brought to light by some Republican representatives' leadership were saying, hey, where were you when we wanted to do this for everyone?
Right. But I'll echo Chris's sentiment. We had to act very quickly on this, and thank goodness the governor did. And he did involve the leadership from the Republican side in the House and Senate right away and kept them in the loop all along. This is how we like to see it run. Unfortunately, don't get your hopes up for next session. And if you're referencing House Bill 253, we were supportive of that. And if you look at the tax structure that we face in the 8 contiguous states, 7 of them either have no income. 7 either have executed a tax cut of some kind. A couple of them don't even have an income tax. So that's a competitive factor. We thought House Bill 253 got at that. And helped, especially in Kansas City, where literally you go across the street and you pay less tax. You have a different regulatory climate. You have a different judicial system that's more favorable for the employer. This is very real competition that's out there, and we are losing currently, especially on the western side of the state. But to the overall question of, do we need to go after each company individually, or will we have a macro approach to being business friendly and competitive? I think we can do both. We always are advocating to make Missouri more competitive, and those measures that we see working in other states. And when you have a special occasion like the Boeing instance, or saving the Ford jobs in Clay Como, you've got to act with that particular target in mind. And thank goodness we did. This is the kind of thing that we absolutely should be competing for and winning.
What are your thoughts?
253 was a silly bill, and I use the term silly on purpose. It had hundreds of millions of dollars of errors in it, just plain errors that the sponsors didn't even know about. It was one of the most incompetent pieces of legislation that in my 17 years I've ever seen. I don't quarrel with any of Dan's goals, but competence is important, and no one could say that they were happy with the competence of the legislature on 253. It was very, very badly done.
What about to his point of targeting specific companies, but also trying to take a broader scope? Do you think which one of those you think works better, I guess, or do we know?
I don't think that it's an either or. I do think that one of the advantages, one of the best ways to recruit people to come into the state is have a workforce that can read or write. We have 100 school districts in rural Missouri that don't teach any foreign language. No intelligent young couple is going to move to a community with that kind of an elementary and secondary school. They're going to take their kids where they can educate their kids. We're cutting our own throat in rural economic development throat in rural Missouri by dumbing down our school system.
What else is, Brian, sorry, go ahead.
I just have a problem with the continuing mantra that somehow or other Missouri is a high tax state. We tend to talk about various comparisons for taxes. Some analysis that we did a few months ago actually looked at the effective tax rate for businesses in both Missouri and all the surrounding states. And what came out of that is that Missouri is in the lower half. It's one of the lowest tax states compared with Kansas, which continues to be in some of the higher tax rates. And I worry about the fact that if we keep cutting the tax rates based on dubious comparisons, then what we're going to be we're going to find ourselves in the position of not being able to fund those services which are essential and which business find necessary in terms of education and infrastructure and public safety. So if we want the quality of schools, we've got to have the resources to be able to do that. And the more we cut back on the potential tax revenues, the less competitive we're going to be on that front. So, I mean, I'm all for making sure that we are competitive in taxes, but let's make sure that we are comparing like with like. And I'm not convinced that much of the argument actually does that.
What are some of the other, I guess?
Well, the idea that a climate where the legal system is favorable to employers. If that were the measure, then employers should go to like Tajikistan or Haiti, where if employees dissent, they just shoot them. There's a reasonable balance there.
Right. There are other considerations, I guess, what you're getting at, right?
But the problem with the legal climate, and it shouldn't be tilted one way or the other. It should be fair. And the problem we have is we see all sorts of claims made on the Missouri side of State Line Road that aren't even brought in Kansas, and it's because they can in Missouri, and they get employers in a position where they have to settle or risk millions of dollars in verdicts or costs in defending themselves. They don't even have these types of things in Kansas with the employment law issue that
or
we
in
dealt
Haiti.
with. Or in Haiti.
Well, I guess one of the things about this particular package of incentives and things that happened last week is there's been some early reporting that Governor Nixon and the Housing Commission are looking at the low-income housing tax credit and what's going to happen with that. I guess what are some of the other impacts we might see from what happened last week? I know you.
It'll be interesting to see whether that is anything other than just a temporary delay for show, and it won't matter unless we change the law with regard to tax credits. And both the legislature and the governor continually overpromise on tax credit reform. People often say, well, tax credits cost $600 million. There's no way that you could reform them to get to $600 million. If you got 200, you'd be wildly successful. Wildly successful.
Let's keep in mind this Boeing bill, for lack of a better title, is the first major economic development package that we've seen in about 5 years, save the Ford bill, and that was another special session. The legislature has been unable to get past this hurdle of, they call it tax credit reform, but it's also that some people have their own axe to grind on low-income housing or just the budget in general or historic tax credits, and it's been the reason given for not creating an incentive package that we could use more effectively for all employers to retain or to attract.
Everybody hates tax credits in general and loves all the specific tax credits is the problem.
It's like the approval rating of Congress is at an all-time low, but you like your local guy.
Well, we're going to have to go to a break here in a few minutes, but I think we can go ahead and start this part of the conversation as well. We've been talking about as we go, how we got to this point, I guess, where companies can, make these kind of requests and states just have to step out and say, okay, here's what we can offer. Here's what we can give you to bring your jobs to our area that we so desperately want. So when did this trend of these states competing really begin?
Well,
maybe Brian, that would be good for you.
Well, I mean, since the 1930s, when Mississippi was attempting to bring jobs from the Chicago area, these incentive packages have been put in place. But certainly since the 60s and 70s, there have been example after example of corporations seeking tax credits, tax benefits from every state. And part of the problem, I mean, it's a two-way thing. Most states and cities see themselves as being in competition with their neighbors. And so they want to be they think about economic development essentially attracting investment from somewhere else as opposed to trying to grow it from inside. So we'll steal next door neighbors' jobs rather than us. So we try and offer the best package. So the whole economic development infrastructure in the United States is very much geared to marketing and competition and what can we steal from our neighbors. And that's how economic developers are rewarded, by the number of projects and number of jobs that can be attracted. On the other side, all the finance directors in corporations across the country and across the world see, well, there's money to be gained here. And no finance director worth his salt is going to think about a development anywhere without seeing what they can extract in lower taxes, training grants, infrastructure, you name it. If we can get it and lower the cost of doing business, we will. So we've got two consenting partners to this, which means that it's almost impossible to stop. I think instinctively, I get very concerned about this continuing bidding wars that we have between states around every new project. But we now seem to be locked into it as a way of life. And as we come back to the Boeing deal, Missouri didn't have any choice but to enter into that arrangement, whether or not it's going to be successful. But if we are successful, then I would imagine that the 1.7 billion or whatever it is we're offering is only going to be a down payment. I think we're going to be under the gun to keep finding more and more money to keep that whole plant going. So we're in a game, and it's very hard for us to get out of it.
Sure.
And we just can't unilaterally disarm. You're
No.
right. That is the game that we're in. You either get in the game or you lose. It's that simple.
I bet if you took all the people in my job or Dan's job or Nixon's job and put them in a room and said, is this whole structure a good one, they'd vote against it. But the fact of the matter is nobody, as Dan said, is going to unilaterally disarm.
Well, I guess there's no plan, right? There's no idea to make that happen. But like you said, I guess every other state would be the same situation, most likely, right? If you got enough smart people in one room, they'd
If
all
Tennessee said they were going to quit doing this tomorrow, I'm sure that our people would say, good, we'll get your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody's taking that first step, right? Because then you're behind.
Everybody has to take the step at the same
that's
time,
right.
and they won't trust each other. They'll
Right.
take a step
That's
backward.
disarmament, right?
Well, back in the 1990s, there was a suggestion that maybe there ought to be a federal law which prohibited this. As you can imagine, that didn't get very far.
Right. Well, we have to take a quick break. I want to remind our audience this is Intersection, a program of KBIA and the Reynolds Journalism Institute. Today we're talking about Missouri's efforts to draw a Boeing 777X production facility to the state. We're also discussing ways the state could attract business in the future. Joining me in studio for the conversation today, Chris Kelly is a Democratic state representative for a part of northeastern Boone County. Dan Meehan is the president and CEO of the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Brian Dobson is the associate dean of MU's Truman School of Public Affairs. I'm Ryan Famuliner. We'll be right back after a short break.